Alistair, please.
Mama, who is the angry man?
How old is he? Get your cloak. You're both coming home.
She had been in the family crypt for 6 years. Alistair had paid for the imported marble. He had watched the damp earth cover the casket. So, the woman sitting behind the dingy Spittlefield's window, biting a stray thread exactly the way his dead wife used to, was an impossibility. The rain in London did not fall. It settled. It hung in the air like a filthy, wet wool blanket, tasting of coal dust, raw sewage, and the metallic tang of the Thames. Alistair Croft, the Duke of Pembroke, hated this part of the city. He hated the squalor that clung to his boots, the desperate, hollow-eyed hawkers shouting over the clatter of iron-rimmed carriage wheels, and the way the damp seeped straight through his tailored worsted coat into his bones. He was here, strictly out of obligation. An inheritance of crumbling tenements from a distant uncle required inspection, and his solicitor, Mr. Cobb, insisted on a walking tour of the boundaries. Cobb was currently droning on about ground rents and leaky slates, his voice a monotonous hum that blended with the steady drum of rain against Alistair's umbrella. Alistair wasn't listening. He hadn't truly listened to anyone in 6 years. His attention was focused solely on placing one booted foot in front of the other, avoiding the deepest puddles of horse dung and mud, waiting for the hour to end so he could return to his cavernous, silent house and pour himself a very large glass of gin. "If your grace would just note the structural sagging on the corner property," Cobb chirped, pointing a gloved finger toward a crooked row of shops. Alistair turned his head. He didn't look at the roofline. His gaze caught on the ground floor. It was a narrow, wretched little storefront, squeezed between a butcher's and a sprawling, noisy tavern. The paint on the trim was peeling in long, diseased strips. A faded wooden sign swinging violently in the wind read, M. Dubois, alterations and mending. Alistair paused on the cobblestones to let a brewer's dray pass. The massive draft horses splashed a wave of gray water over the curb. He stepped back, seeking the shallow shelter of the shop's awning. He shook out his umbrella, the sharp snap of the silk tearing through the street noise. He glanced through the shop's window. The glass was warped, bubbled with age, and slick with condensation on the inside. A single oil lamp burned on a workbench, casting a sickly yellow pool of light over a mountain of cheap gray muslin. A woman sat at the bench. Alistair wiped a streak of grime from the outside of the glass with his thumb. She was in profile, her head bowed over a torn coat. She wore a faded dove-gray bodice that looked thin enough to rip. A woolen shawl was pulled tight around her narrow shoulders. Her hair, a familiar, unremarkable shade of chestnut, was ruthlessly pulled back into a severe knot, though several strands had escaped to cling to her damp neck. His brain registered these details with the sterile detachment of a passing stranger. A poor seamstress, working late, cold. Then, she shifted. She leaned closer to the lamp, squinting. She raised the heavy iron shears to cut a seam, found them too clumsy, and dropped them to the table with a dull thud. Instead, she lifted the fabric to her mouth. She caught the thread between her front teeth, just slightly off-center, and pulled sharply. Snap. Alistair's breath left him in a sudden, violent rush. It wasn't a gasp. It was the physical sensation of having the air punched from his lungs by a fist. The umbrella slipped from his grip, hitting the muddy pavement. "Your Grace," Cobb's voice floated over, sounding miles away. Alistair couldn't speak. He stared. He pressed his gloved hand against the cold, wet brick of the shop facade, just to keep his knees from buckling. His heart didn't flutter with romantic recognition. It seized. Bile rose hot and sour in the back of his throat. He tasted pennies and ash. It was a trick of the light. It was the gin from last night. It was the madness that everyone whispered he had inherited after the carriage accident. He leaned closer, his nose nearly touching the freezing glass. The woman rubbed her eyes with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of soot on her cheekbone. As she did, she turned her head fully toward the street, looking out into the rain with a blank, exhausted stare. The shape of her jaw, the slight, crooked dip in her upper lip, the pale, translucent skin pulled taut over her cheekbones. Genevieve, not a ghost. Ghosts did not have calluses on their fingers. Ghosts did not rub soot on their faces. Ghosts did not sit in freezing spittle fields, mending the moth-eaten coats of strangers. Alistair felt his vision tunnel. The deafening roar of the street faded into a high, ringing whine in his ears. 6 years ago, he had stood in a morgue that smelled heavily of carbolic acid and lavender, staring at a charred ruin of a body pulled from a burned-out carriage on the Dover Road. He had recognized the sapphire ring fused to the blackened hand. He had recognized the remains of the silk dress he had bought her. He had buried her. He had spent 3 years wanting to die, and another 3 learning how to exist as an empty shell. Your Grace, you look frightfully pale. Are you quite well? Cobb was touching his elbow now, tugging urgently. Alistair violently yanked his arm away. He didn't look at the solicitor. He couldn't tear his eyes from the window. His stomach roiled. He wanted to throw up in the gutter. He wanted to shatter the glass with his bare hands. The contradictions tore at him. Jagged and ugly, an overwhelming, crushing tidal wave of relief, instantly swallowed by a blinding, venomous rage. She was alive. She had let him bury her. Alistair didn't think. He didn't plan what he would say. He simply turned, his boots splashing heavily in the puddles, and grabbed the rusted iron handle of the shop door. The bell above the door was horribly loud. It didn't chime. It clattered, a harsh, tinny shriek that scraped against the inside of Alistair's skull. The heat inside the shop was oppressive, smelling of scorched linen, sizing, and stale cabbage. The floorboards, warped from years of damp boots, groaned under his weight. He stood just inside the threshold, the door clicking shut behind him, cutting off the noise of the street like a severed nerve. Water dripped from the brim of his top hat, hitting the floor with a steady times. Tick, tick, tick. Genevieve hadn't looked up. Her back was partially turned to him now, her shoulders hunched as she aggressively attacked a stubborn buttonhole. "Just a moment, please," she said. The voice, it wasn't a memory anymore. It was real, vibrating in the humid air of the shop. It was slightly rougher than he remembered, lacking the polished, upper-class lilt she had perfected during their marriage, but the cadence was entirely hers. Alistair stood frozen. His jaw was clenched so hard his teeth ached. He tried to unbutton his coat, needing air, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. His fine leather gloves felt stiff, unnatural. When he didn't speak, she sighed a heavy, bone-deep sound of exhaustion and turned around on her wooden stool. I said, "I will be with you. In a..." The words died in her throat. For a second that stretched into an eternity, neither of them breathed. Genevieve stared at him. The color drained from her face so rapidly, Alistair thought she might actually faint. Her eyes, wide and terrified, tracked over his tailored clothes, his broad shoulders, and finally locked onto his face. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out his name. Her hand simply opened. The heavy iron shears dropped, hitting the floorboards with a violent, final times, crack times that made them both flinch. "Alistair," she whispered. It was barely a sound, just a breath pushed through paralyzed lips. Alistair took a step forward. The anger, hot and sharp, finally pierced through the shock. He wanted to demand an explanation. He wanted to scream at her until his throat bled. He opened his mouth, the accusations piling up on his tongue. "How could you? I bought the marble. I watched the earth. I wanted to die." But before the first ugly word could leave his mouth, a noise from the back of the shop shattered the silence. It was the heavy drag of a curtain being pulled aside, followed by the rapid, uneven slap of small, bare feet on wood. "Mama! Mama! The stray cat came back. He scratched the door." A little boy burst through the faded velvet curtain that separated the shop from whatever miserable back room existed behind it. He was wearing an oversized, coarse woolen shirt, that swallowed his small frame, his knees scuffed and dirty. In one hand, he clutched a battered wooden block. Genevieve made a sudden, desperate noise, a strangled gasp, and lunged forward. She tried to step between Alistair and the boy, her skirts tangling around her ankles. But she was too slow. The boy skidded to a halt a few feet away, sensing the tension in the room. He looked up, his small chest heaving, and stared directly at Alistair. Alistair looked down. The breath he had finally managed to draw stalled in his lungs. The boy was perhaps 5 years old. He had Genevieve's chestnut hair, messy and overgrown, curling around his ears. He had her slight, delicate jaw. But when the boy looked up, blinking against the harsh yellow light of the oil lamp, Alistair saw his own face staring back at him. They weren't just similar eyes. They were an exact, terrifying replica. The Croft lineage carried a distinct genetic marker, a pale, icy gray iris with a dark, almost charcoal rim, framed by heavily hooded lids. It was an intimidating gaze, one that Alistair used to his advantage in boardrooms and parliament. To see it here, set into the soft, smudged face of a child in a squalid tailor's shop, was like staring into a funhouse mirror. The boy even had the exact same crooked left eyebrow, rising slightly in childish curiosity. Alistair felt the blood roaring in his ears. The math clicked into place with the cold precision of a falling guillotine blade. 6 years since the carriage fire, a boy who was clearly around 5. Genevieve had been pregnant. She had known she was pregnant, faked her death, let another woman burn in her place, and vanished into the slums of London with his heir. Alistair couldn't look away from the child. The boy stared back, unabashed, clutching his wooden block tightly against his chest. "Mama?" the boy asked, his high voice wavering. He stepped closer to Genevieve, grabbing a handful of her faded gray skirt. "Who is the angry man?" Genevieve's hands were shaking violently. She placed a protective hand on the boy's head, pressing his face into the side of her leg, shielding him from Alistair's gaze. She looked up at her husband, her eyes filled with a desperate, animal panic. "Alistair, please," she breathed, the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic whisper. "Please, not here. I can explain." Alistair looked from the top of the boy's head to the woman he had mourned until it broke him. The smell of the shop, the poverty, the desperation, the lies was suffocating. He felt a profound, terrifying coldness settle over his heart, freezing the raw edges of his grief into something hard and sharp as a diamond. "Explain?" Alistair's voice didn't belong to him. It was a raspy, gravelly thing, stripped of all aristocratic polish. It sounded dead. "Explain how my wife is standing in front of me in a Spitalfield slum, or explain the boy holding onto your skirts." Genevieve swallowed hard. "Both." Alistair took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He towered over her in the cramped space. He could smell the cheap lavender soap she used on her skin. He could see the pulse jumping wildly at the base of her throat. "Get your cloak," Alistair said. The words were a command, flat and devoid of any warmth. Genevieve didn't move. Her grip on the boy's hair tightened. "Alistair," I said, Alistair repeated, leaning in until he could see the terrified reflection of his own face in her dark eyes. "Get your cloak. We are leaving. Now." The boy peeked out from behind her skirt, his gray eyes flashing with sudden defiance. "Don't yell at my mama." Alistair looked down at the boy, his son, a son he didn't know existed, a son who wore rags and defended a ghost. Alistair's hands curled into tight fists at his sides to stop them from reaching out. He didn't know if he wanted to grab the child and hold him, or tear the shop apart barehanded. "I am not yelling," Alistair said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating hum. He looked back at Genevieve. "But if you do not walk out of that door with me this instant, Jenny, I will burn this miserable shop to the ground and take him anyway. Choose." The carriage ride to Mayfair was suffocating. Outside, the storm battered the lacquered roof in a relentless, angry rhythm, but inside, the silence was absolute. The space smelled aggressively of Alistair's world, oiled leather, fine Spanish tobacco, and the sharp, clean scent of bay rum. It was a sterile, wealthy smell. It clashed violently with the damp wool, cheap lye soap, and desperation radiating from the opposite seat. Alistair sat in the shadows, his long legs crossed, staring at the strangers who belonged to him. Genevieve sat entirely rigid on the edge of the velvet squabs. She had thrown a thin, threadbare cloak over her shoulders, but she was shivering. Not from the cold, the carriage had a heated brick at her feet, but from a deep, uncontrollable nervous tremor. Her hands, red and swollen at the knuckles, were knotted tightly in her lap. She wouldn't look at him. She stared fixedly at the brass door handle, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Between them sat the boy. He was the only one moving. He had stopped crying the moment he saw the horses. Now, he was tracing the plush velvet of the seats with a dirty, fascinated finger. He had a smudge of soot on his nose. "Is this your house?" the boy asked suddenly, his voice small, but remarkably steady, as he patted the upholstery. Alistair's chest tightened. It was agonizing, looking at the child. He saw his own father's chin. He saw his own heavily hooded eyes. The boy was a ghost made flesh, a walking, breathing monument to a life Alistair had been robbed of. "No," Alistair said. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "This is a carriage. My house is larger." "Oh." The boy considered this, kicking his scuffed boots against the mahogany paneling. "My name is Henry. Mama says I shouldn't speak to angry men, but you have horses. I like horses." "Henry." Alistair felt a sudden sharp sting behind his eyes. He blinked hard, swallowing the bile in his throat. He looked at Genevieve. She had flinched when the boy spoke his name, her shoulders hunching further inward. "Henry is a strong name," Alistair managed to say. He didn't look away from Genevieve. "Did your mother choose it?" "Yes," Henry chirped. Genevieve finally met Alistair's gaze. Her dark eyes were entirely hollow. There was no defiance left in them, only the dull, glassy sheen of a trapped animal waiting for the trap to spring. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt before the imposing limestone facade of the Pembroke townhouse, the footman opened the door, letting in a gust of freezing rain. Alistair stepped out first. He did not offer his hand to his wife. He stood on the wet pavement, the gaslight flickering over his hard, pale face, and waited. Genevieve climbed down, lifting Henry down after her. The boy gasped at the size of the house, his head tilting back to take in the 4 stories of lit windows. The heavy oak doors swung open before Alistair even reached the top step. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, stood in the vestibule. She was a stern, uncompromising woman who had managed the Croft household for 30 years. She took one look at Alistair's face, then looked past him to the shivering woman in the faded gray cloak. Mrs. Gable's hands flew to her mouth. A choked, horrified sound escaped her throat. "Good God," she whispered, her face draining of color. "Ma'am?" Alistair didn't stop to indulge the shock. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his tone clipping through the vestibule like a whip. "Take the boy to the kitchens. Feed him whatever he wants. Have a bath drawn. He is not to be left alone." Mrs. Gable tore her eyes from Genevieve, looking down at Henry. The recognition hit her instantly, too. Her hands shook as she reached out. "Yes, yes, Your Grace." "Come along, little one." Henry looked up at his mother. Genevieve knelt on the marble floor, completely heedless of the wet mud on her boots, and pulled the boy into a crushing, desperate hug. She buried her face in his neck. Alistair could see her shoulders shaking. She was whispering frantically into his hair. "Go with the lady, Henry," she finally said, her voice cracking. "Mama will be right here, I promise." When she stood back up, she looked older than her 28 years. The soft, luminous girl Alistair had married was gone. In her place was a woman forged in poverty, hardened by secrets, standing in a grand foyer that felt like a mausoleum. "My study," Alistair commanded. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He walked down the long, carpeted hall, the silence of the house pressing down on him. The study was dim, lit only by a low-burning fire in the massive marble hearth. Alistair walked straight to the mahogany sideboard. His hands were shaking so violently that the heavy crystal decanter clinked loudly against the rim of the glass. He poured 3 fingers of gin and drank it straight down. It burned like acid. It didn't help. He poured another. He turned. Genevieve was standing just inside the doorway. She hadn't taken off the wet cloak. She looked incredibly small against the towering bookshelves. "Sit," he said. "I prefer to stand." "I do not care what you prefer," Alistair snapped, the volume of his voice making her flinch. The anger he had been swallowing for the last hour finally broke loose, hot and ugly. He hurled the crystal glass into the hearth. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces against the brick. 6 years, Alistair roared, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped inches from her, breathing heavily. 6 years I went to that crypt, Genevieve. I bought flowers. I paid a man to polish the brass plaque with your name on it. I drank myself into a stupor every anniversary because the smell of burning wood made me want to tear my own skin off. Genevieve closed her eyes. Tears were finally spilling over her lashes, tracking through the soot on her cheeks. "Who did I bury?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, vibrating hiss. "Tell me." "A maid," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Her name was Sarah. We had hired her in Dover. And you let me put her in the family vault." The carriage hit the embankment, Alistair. "You weren't there." She opened her eyes, and suddenly, the fear was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding exhaustion. The wheel snapped. The carriage rolled. I was thrown clear, into the ditch. Sarah. She was trapped inside when the lantern shattered. The flames went up so fast. I tried. God, Alistair. I tried to open the door, but the metal was melting. I burned my hands. She held up her hands. For the first time, Alistair looked closely at them. Beneath the calluses from the needlework, the skin across her palms was slick, scarred, and puckered with old, deep burns. His stomach heaved. "I sat in the mud," she continued, her voice going hollow, retreating into the memory. "I watched the carriage burn. I knew she was dead. And then the local magistrate's men came. They found Sarah's body. They found my sapphire ring fused to her finger. She had been admiring it. I let her try it on. They assumed she was the Duchess. And you walked away." "Yes." "Why?" The word tore out of him, a pathetic, ragged sound. "Why would you do that to me? Was I such a monster?" Genevieve looked at him, and the pity in her eyes was worse than hatred. "You weren't a monster, Alistair. You were just empty. We were empty." She walked past him, moving toward the fire, pulling the thin cloak tighter. "You were obsessed with Parliament, with your legacy. I lost the first baby, and you didn't even come home from the House of Lords for 2 days. I sat in a bed full of blood, and you sent a note from your club telling me to rest." Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had been terrified of her grief back then. He hadn't known how to fix it, so he had run from it, hiding behind his title and his work. "I found out I was pregnant with Henry 3 days before the trip to Dover," she said quietly, staring into the flames. "I was terrified. I knew what would happen. I would give birth. If it was a boy, he would be handed over to wet nurses, then tutors. He would be raised to be cold and hard and perfectly detached, just like you. And I would go back to being the beautiful, silent ghost haunting this massive, dead house." She turned to face him. Standing in that ditch, covered in mud, I realized the fire had given me a choice. I could go back and let this house slowly suffocate me, or I could be dead and be free. Alistair staggered backward. His knees hit the edge of the leather sofa, and he sank heavily onto it. He put his head in his hands, pulling at his hair. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. He had expected maliciousness. He had expected an affair. He hadn't expected the brutal, undeniable truth. She had fled into grinding poverty, chosen to starve in Spitalfields, simply to keep their child away from him. "It was cruel," Genevieve whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. "It was the most cowardly, selfish thing a person could do. I lied to you. I let you grieve. Every time Henry went hungry, every time I had to pawn a petticoat for coal, I thought about walking to this house and begging your forgiveness. But then I would look at him. I would see how he laughed, how loud and messy and alive he was, and I knew I couldn't let you turn him into marble." Alistair slowly raised his head. His icy gray eyes were bloodshot, tracking her face. He didn't forgive her. The betrayal was a jagged, rotting thing in his chest. But as he looked at her calloused hands, her cheap clothes, and the fierce, protective set of her jaw, he realized something terrifying. He respected her. The docile, porcelain girl he had married would never have survived 6 years in the slums. She would never have cut a seam with her teeth. She had burned her own life down to protect her son, and she had built a new one out of ash and thread. "He needs a tutor," Alistair said. Genevieve stopped, her breath hitched. "Alistair, he is 5, Alistair continued, his voice flat, exhausted, but entirely steady. "He cannot read. He wears rags. He is the heir to a dukedom, and he thinks a carriage is a house. He needs a tutor, and he needs a proper bed." Genevieve stared at him, her lips parting. She didn't know what to do with the lack of screaming. "What are you saying?" Alistair stood up. He walked to the hearth, avoiding the shattered glass, and looked down at the dying embers. "I am saying," Alistair murmured, closing his eyes, "that the world believes my wife is dead, and I am not entirely sure who you are, but you are the mother of my son." He turned back to her. The vast, impossible chasm of the last 6 years stood between them, a graveyard of lies, resentment, and unbearable grief. It could not be crossed in a night. It might never be crossed, but the heavy, suffocating silence of the Mayfair house had finally been broken by the sound of a child's boots on the stairs. "Take off your wet cloak, Genevieve," Alistair said softly. "We are going to have dinner." If you found yourself holding your breath during Alistair and Genevieve's tense reunion, you're not alone. The scars of the past don't heal overnight, and their messy, deeply human journey is just beginning. What do you think? Was Genevieve justified in running, or did Alistair deserve the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this raw, emotional story, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more original, historical dramas.